You're listening to TFM.
Want to join in the conversation and share your thoughts on this episode? Join the Babel Conference, our listeners' discussion group on Facebook. Just type BABEL into the Facebook search field, and we'll look forward to seeing you there. Well, hello and welcome to TFM's local watering hole, and coming at you there from ancient Rome. So I'm not really sure how you're getting this, but it's the magic of the internet, and I am just one of the hosts here, Matthew Rushing, and I'm so excited to welcome back Zachary Fruhling. Zachary, how are you doing?
Thanks, Matt. I am Gladiator to be here, as usual.
Very nice. Well done. Well done. So we are going to be talking about one of the biggest movies of the 2000s, which was Gladiator, starring Russell Crowe. Really excited to dive into this one. But before we get there, of course, you can subscribe to us wherever you're listening. That way you'll get all of our episodes as soon as they release. Of course, you can also find us on social media. We would love it if you would interact with us and follow us over there on places like X at the 602 Club, of course, on Instagram at the 602 Club TFM. We've got the entire network on Facebook at facebook.com/TrekFM. You can find us online at trek.fm as well. And you can support us over at Patreon at patreon.com/TrekFM, and make sure that everything that we do here keeps coming to you each and every week. And so I wanted, before we even dive into anything, Zach, I just wanted to know for you, with, Gladiator, was this like a movie that, caught your attention when it came out? Was it something that you saw back then that you were excited for? I'm just wondering kind of, where you are with this movie and maybe what your history is with it.
Yeah, honestly, I didn't see it when it came out. When it came out, I was head down with grad school, in my early years of grad school, and I really wasn't seeing film very much. So it would have been right up my alley. I've always had an interest in classics. I took Latin in college, for example, and you'd think it would be right up my alley. I just didn't get that far. So I actually don't remember the first time I saw it. I saw it sometime after it came out, probably on DVD at some point, but I really don't even remember the first time. I didn't see it in the theater, though.
Nice. Okay. Well, I totally understand that. There are those movies that almost feels like, even if you didn't see when they came out, it's hard to even remember when you first saw them, just because they become so ingrained for you. And so get that completely. I did go see this in theaters. This was, I was at that point in college, and I'm really starting to kind of spread my wings when it comes to film, and this was definitely one that I was excited for and looking forward to when it came out, which is another part of this is the fact that this is kind of a return to the sword and sandals films that had been so popular in early Hollywood, especially in the 60s, with those big movies like Ben-Hur, the Ten Commandments, Spartacus, and the like. And so I'm really interested for you, was that a part of film history that you had grown up with? Had you watched those films? Were you, aware of those things, so that, kind of when we get to this, it's like, yeah, there's been kind of a huge break between those films and then doing this.
I think, honestly, Braveheart probably paved the way for this film. You and I had talked about Braveheart some time ago, and there's no way this film would have happened if Braveheart hadn't been successful, because it was really Braveheart just a small number of years before that brought the epic genre back. And so some of these battle scenes, like the first, 10 or 15 minutes of the film, that could never have happened without what Braveheart did. So, I was prepared for it, and I enjoyed it when I encountered the film, but I think probably only because I saw Braveheart first.
Nice. No, that makes sense. It's interesting for me. Many people who've listened to this show know that I grew up watching a diet of older films, from black and white movies to Westerns to, all of those incredible classics from the 60s, like a Ben-Hur, Ten Commandments, Spartacus, and the like. I grew up with all of those movies. So this was a genre that the sword and sandals I was very, familiar with. And I always enjoyed those type of movies. And I think you're 100% right in nailing that. I don't think that this film gets made without the fact that Braveheart had been successful. Another part of this film, its history, is the fact that, Steven Spielberg became interested in it because of the fact that, he had done Amistad, and saw the script and really liked it. And, so he was also interested in this. And so, but yeah, I mean, this was, though, in many ways, even though Braveheart had been obviously successful, this is a risk for the studios to take in creating this film, because obviously this is one of those movies, like the scale of it is astounding. And then, of course, what they're going to try and do with making you feel like you're back in ancient Rome and in the Colosseum is something that nobody had really attempted, I don't think, anything on this type of scale before when it comes to recreating our lost history in this way.
Yeah, it's like in the 70s and 80s with the gritty realism that you see in film and television from that time period. The stories kind of shrunk in scope in some way, and and in this time period, the scope of film started to expand again. You could get epics, and I love epics in general. I like epic literature, so this is in line with my view of what good fiction should be, for sure. It was fascinating to we talked about Braveheart just a little bit, but it's fascinating to kind of see the evolution. Like, some of the battle scenes really did remind me of Braveheart, but they have kind of a sheen to them, a gloss on them, with the filters that were put on the camera and with the different camera speeds and different effects that were used. It's like Braveheart battle scenes plus. It didn't take too many years for the technology and the style to emerge even further, I think. The artsiness of it's a very artsy movie. It's not I would say compared to Braveheart, Braveheart has that kind of realism to it. It's not a lot of filters and layers and effects. There's, maybe some different camera speeds, but this is a very glossy movie compared to Braveheart, I think.
Well, I think a part of that too is that by creating those effects, you're able to kind of marry everything you need to do, especially once you get to Rome, visual effects wise, so everything's consistent. And I think that's obviously something that you begin to see in many films where there's a really tight control. And of course, at this point too, the Lord of the Rings films had come out. And those movies are renowned for the fact that they went and color graded every single basically shot of the film to be consistent and to marry everything together and make you feel as though there's not a moment, hopefully, that you're getting pulled out, right? And I think Gladiator, in some ways, we talked about Braveheart, but I also think it owes a lot to the fact that the Lord of the Rings films had become successful at this point as well. And people were kind of gravitating to these kind of epic stories. And, again, this one is still a risk because we hadn't done something set in our own ancient history like this in quite some time. And so, but I think you rightly pointing out the way in which you see the way the movie is shot, the way the movie, kind of presents itself through the desaturation, or, the way in which they kind of use even some slow motion and, all those type of things. All of this is working together to kind of, I think, in many ways, just sell us back into this time period. But also, I think, to make, movies had changed completely since the last major sword and sandals type of film had come out. And so this movie very much, I think, mirrors a lot of the things that, you take the Braveheart-like gritty action sequences, but then I think you've married that with a lot of the stuff that Jackson did in the Lord of the Rings films, and you kind of put it all together in a blender with, Ben-Hur and Spartacus, and you get Gladiator, which, I think we know from the box office and from the fact that this movie continues to be one that people talk about and watch, it was successful. People ended up loving it. And it really created a resurgence then in these types of films being able to be made, whether, you got Troy then and Alexander and all these other films that came out afterwards. And so, yeah, I mean, this did great.
I think you're right that Gladiator is probably not a pioneer of any of these particular things, whether it's the color scheme or the gloss or the CGI. Of course, it's like the natural consequence of all those things put together. I'm thinking of movies from the late 90s like The Matrix that has its own color palette, so to speak, or Fight Club that has its own color palette in the various scenes because of the filtering that's used. And what I do like about the way that's done in this film, I like that the different portions of the movie have their own color palettes, like Maximus's dream sequence have their own color palette, so to speak. It's very immersive, I think, and kind of shows what I don't know, how do you show them what a dream would look like? Dreams are supposed to be less colored than real life, right? In some way, and it captures what a dream sequence would be. I like that. I think it's very, very well done, but not terribly pioneering. It's just the evolution of all the things we'd already talked about.
I think that's one of the things too, like the movie also does, which is that it has a color palette for all the different type of places that you end up in the film. The Germany sequence at the beginning has its own kind of like muted color palette that, everything feels almost like you're covered in mud, and so does the look. You have the sequence of then, being in the desert and that very brown hued, and then you get to Rome and it has this kind of golden hue to it, and every part of this film is saying something through that color palette, and as many films do, and like you said, it's not necessarily anything new. I do think that it just stands out as we're trying to make a type of genre work for the modern audience. I think, really Scott does a fantastic job and really bringing that then to the modern audience in a way that they can digest and understand, but I think also then allows us to maybe get as close as we would ever get to living in, ancient Rome for a while and kind of having a sense of what it's like.
I think it works exceedingly well. I mean, obviously the power of imagery was not lost on the ancient Romans themselves. So if you can evoke that in some way that's successful, that's amazing.
Absolutely. I mean, I was just reading Tom Holland's third book in his Roman series, Pax, and the whole, every Roman emperor, especially in that time period that he's covering, from Nero to Hadrian, has a massive works project that they do, and they're putting their own stamp on Rome. And of course, in that time period, you also have what was known then as the Flavian amphitheater, which we know as the Colosseum. And so, yeah, I mean, to do that then creates something really, really interesting. And maybe it's a great time, I think, because we're already discussing it. But one of the biggest successes, I think, of the film is the production of it, which we recreate Rome, the Colosseum, these epic battles, the sets, the location shooting that we do, and we create this realism. I mean, the set that was supposed to be Germany was actually filmed in England, and it was a section of woods that was going to be cut down. So they were able to actually literally create this set on location that is massive and is in a forest, and has been clear cut the way they want it to be because the rest of it's going to be cut down, and then they can do what they need to with it. And Ridley Scott wanted snow, and it literally snowed. It's real snow.
Well, it's easy to forget how big the Roman Empire really was, right? It's not implausible that that's where Romans would have been, right?
Yeah. So I just think, I as I'm thinking about the film, I think one of the things that makes it such a success really is the attention to detail that they have, the fact that they're finding all of these locations for real, and their goal was to make this feel, even with all the trickery that they use, as real as possible, so that one felt as though, and this is, I think, probably the most successful part of the film, that you were in the Colosseum, like an ancient Roman, seeing it the same way they would have at that time period.
I can't imagine another depiction prior of events in the Colosseum prior to Gladiator that was anywhere near as convincing. I mean, it really is amazing when you look at it.
I mean, I think the only one, obviously, is the chariot race in Ben-Hur.
Yeah, obviously.
Which,
sure.
It when you think of that time period, too, and what they were able to accomplish then, it's astounding, right? And so, and I think that's the thing, is that, to me, the fact that this stands up to that work and right alongside it, so when I do, of course, think the Colosseum, I think of those two films.
Those two films, absolutely.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, there's just, that's where I think this film really stands apart. And again, when you had all of these other films come later, whether it was Alexander or Troy or the like, and they're trying to, I think, kind of recapture the same kind of magic you got in Gladiator, they may or may not have been as successful. And I think a big part of that here is, the attention to detail with the production value and the production work put in the production designers, the art directors, and all of that, created something that pulled you in and never let you go until the film ended.
Well, what I think the film does really successfully, it manages to balance the epic scope of it and the gritty realism and the kind of glossy sheen we talked about, and doing all of that, but not sacrificing anything of the human stories. This is a very, very touching human dramatic story, and I'd say the interpersonal scenes that are small in scope, say between Maximus and Commodus, or between Commodus and his sister, or whomever, those are really dramatic scenes that fit very, very comfortably inside this movie.
Well, and I'm glad you mentioned that, because one of the most interesting things about this film is the fact that it was plagued by script issues almost the entire time. That they were constantly rewriting things during shooting and finding the characters and finding their stories. And you end up, honestly, too, with Russell Crowe, who's throughout most of the filming not actually very happy with a lot of it, because there's too many times where they're just like telling him, like, go out and do something, what would you do here, and a lot of the stuff ends up, I mean, he came up with quite a few of the things, like, the at my signal, unleash hell, and so it's one of those places where I'm astounded that the movie ends up working the way it does, because there's such turmoil behind the scenes, and yet I think it's one of those places where, and much like the Roman Empire itself, it's the struggle that ended up making it something great. Like, that out of the struggle, and people, working as hard and diligently and even maybe as frustratingly as they can, they're in the end able to create something astounding that stands, the test of time.
It's interesting you say that there were problems with the dialogue, because I got the sense along the way that there were moments in the film where they probably couldn't think of anything to say. They just chew on Russell Crowe's facial reaction. There feels like there should be some dialogue here, but we're just going to linger on Russell Crowe's face for a little bit. It works very well. Maybe they just couldn't think of any good dialogue to plug in there, and went for some good reaction shots.
Well, and I think that's, one of the places too, and I'm glad you mentioned that, because I do think that there are times in the movie where just a look says everything. And, I think the film is actually able to overcome the script issues because of the cast. And I do think specifically because Russell Crowe embodies the character of Maximus. He embodies who this person is, and he tells you who he is in every single one of his actions, whether it's rubbing the dirt in his hands, or the way that he kind of just longingly will stare out into space, and from the beginning of the film that he's thinking of that dream of just being home with his wife and his son. he wants, he longs to be back there just to be a simple farmer again. And I think without him, I don't know if anybody else makes this work the way that he does and just kind of draws you into the character. And, I think from the very beginning, you just buy that this guy is a real guy.
Do you think he had any sense at the time that he was creating a career-defining role? I mean, I'm not sure of your take on this, but it strikes me that this is Russell Crowe's career-defining role for sure.
I think that Russell Crowe, and I was reading some quotes from him, I think that he was cocky enough to believe that he was the good enough actor to make anything work. And he is cocky. I have a friend of mine worked at the Fairmont Hotel in San Francisco and met Russell Crowe and said he was a cocky when he came into the hotel. Yeah. So, I think that though that's for them, the blessing of casting him was getting somebody who was willing to struggle to figure out what needed to happen, and I think in some ways had the, he even talks about the idea of his own kind of volatility, is what allowed this to come forth on screen. Again, I think it really is him that just makes this work.
And yet he displays a remarkable degree of, I would say, just emotional sensitivity in his facial expressions.
Well, exactly. I think you saying that makes me think of, the moment where, the battle is over. He's at the shrine in his room and he's praying and he's talking about, his wife and his son, to his aid. And there's such tenderness and like love. And I think, again, that's the genius of his portrayal in the film, is that he can play every single aspect that you need. And you're 100%, he 100% zeroes you in on what you're supposed to be feeling along with the character. And there's never a moment where you're like, oh, that doesn't feel right.
I have to say, though, for me, it really is Joaquin Phoenix that steals the show in this movie.
Yeah, I think what's really interesting here is that there's nobody better who plays kind of like amoral, psychopathic, power-hungry jerk than him. I mean,
in a very quiet, soft-spoken way. It's very, he does creepy really well.
I mean, it's obviously the reason he was the Joker. It's what's funny here, and I don't know if you've seen it yet, but I saw Napoleon that stars him, that Ridley Scott directed.
No, not yet.
And basically, he plays Napoleon, unfortunately, very similar to me, to the way he did Commodus, and it does not work in that film, where here, it completely works. And no, I agree with you. I think he makes the villain that you love to hate, and that you can't wait to see die, right? And you hope dies. Like when you're watching this first time, you don't know if that's going to happen. And thankfully,
well, you especially don't know it's going to happen because this is not a historical story.
Exactly.
Right? This is a completely fabricated story. Of course, Commodus was killed, but he wasn't killed in this context. And he was the son of Marcus Aurelius, and they play fast and loose with the characters and the actual history, so you don't actually know what's going to happen.
Which, like you said, I think one of the beauties of this movie is that it's historical. It's historical fiction, though. And so therefore it allows you to kind of feel like you're in that ancient world, but they don't have to follow any specific script. And so that allows the audience to truly be drawn in and, like you said, be surprised. And I think, one of the big surprises in this film, like you mentioned, is just the way that Joaquin Phoenix is just able to make your skin crawl.
I wanted to ask you this because I know you share a love of history like I do. What are your thoughts on just basically the genre of historical fiction in general? I mean, it's one thing to create a film that is trying to bring actual historical events to life, and then it's another thing to have a film that uses historical characters in a completely fictionalized story that only loosely resembles history. And I think Gladiator probably goes in the latter category, I think. Does that do a service to history or disservice to history or both? There are people that probably think Gladiator was actual history, and that would be unfortunate if they thought that.
It's really, it's a good question. And I think, we obviously touched on this with Braveheart, right? Because, in some ways there's a historicity to that, but it's also things that are being extrapolated, and, or, maybe completely made up. And I do think that, and it is one of the dangers with film, right, is that specifically people can just take things at face value. But I do think that there's something special about being able to see something on film like this and make us feel like we're there and all of that. But, I do think as the audience member, we also have to be aware that no matter how close a film is, it's always going to be in some semblance fiction, even if it's based off a true story. In fact, any movie that says based off a true story is still somewhat fiction, because there are places where they've added so to me, I don't think that it does a disservice to history. I think what the beauty of these types of films, whether it's Braveheart or this or any historical epic or even any based off a true story, right? I think of the fact that, like Killers of the Flower Moon just came out this year, and it's also based off a true story. And any of those, to me, the power of them is that so much of the time, those books that they're based off of or stories that they're based off of, those become bestsellers, right? Because people want to go and know the truth of the matter. And so I think more than anything that these films actually do a service to the importance that history is to us and should be to us. And I always appreciate it that they actually, make people go and read about the true history. And I think that's the thing that's really awesome. And hopefully that's something that will continue as we move further on in the future. But that's how I feel. What do you think about that? Do you agree, or is it some mix, or what do you think?
Oh, completely. I think, as you know, I'm a college instructor, and I'm constantly disturbed a bit by the lack of historical awareness that my students have about Western culture or Western history, ancient or relatively modern even. And so anything that provides historical context for Western culture is probably a good thing in my mind. And of course, as a philosophy instructor and philosopher, I'm particularly intrigued by the portrayal of Marcus Aurelius, one of the central Stoic philosophers from the Hellenistic time period. So, I think, if this causes anyone to go research anything about Roman history or research anything about Marcus Aurelius or Stoicism or anything remotely related, that's probably a good thing for culture in general, given this relatively ahistorical age we live in.
Mm-hmm. No, I couldn't agree more, which is a great question. With you being a student of somebody like Marcus Aurelius, what did you think of the portrayal here from Richard Harris, one of his final roles?
Honestly, I think it's incredibly convincing. It's hard for us to imagine, I think, what it would have been like to be a Roman emperor. You have life or death power over everyone in the known universe, essentially, right? You can have all the money you want brought to you. You can have all the wine you want and live in a drunken stupor for the 20 years you're emperor if you want to, right? It takes an immense amount of self-control to be a good Roman emperor, and Marcus Aurelius was known as the last of the good Roman emperors. Probably the closest example you can point to in actual history of any time period anywhere in the world of what Plato called the philosopher king, someone who didn't want to be emperor but became emperor and has the self-discipline and wisdom and temperance and knowledge and virtue to actually be a good emperor and do consistently good things, given that he can basically behead anyone he wants on a whim. An incredible amount of self-control, and it comes through in Marcus Aurelius's writings. Mainly we have his diary, which I think they're showing him writing inside the movie. Is a scene where he's writing pages of something. He's probably writing his meditations. That's what he's known for in philosophy, which was his private journal to himself, and basically notes about how to be a good person, given all the many difficulties he had to face. But I think what's interesting about Marcus Aurelius is how tragic of a figure he really is. You get the sense from reading doing his actual work in the real world, that he did just want to be a philosopher and read his books and do good things. And he had the huge misfortune of being born into such a circumstance that he became Roman emperor, and he has to do right by the empire and right by the people around him, and put up with all of the how to put it, all of the I'm trying to struggle even to think of the right word. All of the lack of all the selfishness and the greed and the ambition and all of the lesser qualities of everyone around him. And he has to deal with it every single day. Every time someone encounters him, someone wants something from him. And he consistently does good things. He really stands out in history in that regard. So I think the portrayal of him in the movie was remarkably well done. You do get the sense that Marcus Aurelius is tired. He's had a huge weight on his shoulders. He cares a lot about Rome for Rome's sake. He cares a lot about virtue. We talk about the cardinal virtues inside the movie. And of course, most Roman emperors didn't have those qualities, much less most world leaders in general. So, I'm glad they portrayed him in a way that did justice to the kind of person that he really was. You know, he had to go out and conquer. He had to wage war. He had to defend the empire. He had to do all the things all the Roman emperors do, but he really cared about virtue for virtue's sake. And that comes across in his works and in the film, I'm glad to see.
Yeah, I think Richard Harris is great. I love him as an actor, and especially in his later life. You know, it was always a huge blow to me that he was not able to complete the Harry Potter series as Dumbledore. I think he's just phenomenal here. I love, too, that these types of movies created a resurgence in his career, that people would then go back and find his earlier works. And as you mentioned, I think one of the beauties of his portrayal is that he does such a great job in the short amount of screen time he has of portraying the type of person he is and why he's doing what he's doing with Maximus, in the sense that Maximus doesn't want power either. He didn't want to be a general. He didn't want to be any of those things, but he has power thrust upon him. And these two become the people in which kind of are living out that axiom of, you know, the best leaders are the ones who don't seek power but have it put upon them. And so I think Harris does such a great job in that, and it becomes such an interesting thing to see. But on top of that, I love the juxtaposition of him with somebody like Oliver Reed, who plays Proximo, you know, who is somebody who embodies that spirit of, and it's interesting because I you know, Ridley Scott is a British filmmaker, but he almost embodies that American spirit of pull yourself up by your own bootstraps, you know, and make your own destiny. And I really love Oliver Reed's performance in the film. It's such an incredibly moving performance, and it's terrible and sad that he died, and that, in fact, his last scene in the film was one that they had to put together through a lot of CGI trickery from previous scenes that they hadn't used to actually create his last scene, because he was actually supposed to live. And through his death, they weren't able to do that. So they had to work this. But his performance, to me, is one that is such a great juxtaposition between, in that almost triad of relationships between him, Marcus Aurelius, and of course Maximus.
Well, Proximo is an interesting character, and I get the sense you probably agree with this. I think there are just different types of people. There are people that I think have probably a more sensitive temperament. Virtue comes naturally to them. They tend to do the right thing. And, you know, those people have to be dragged out of their shell to do something bad once in a while. And I think there's the other personality type. There are people, you know, whether by nature or by nurture, by their experience or by temperament, they're entertainers, or they're business people, and they play fast and loose with the rules. They have ambition, they have whatever, and they have to kind of learn to do the right thing. And I think Proximo has to learn that Rome for Rome's sake and all the virtues that go with it are good in and of themselves, aside from his own personal gain. And that's part of his story arc. He has to learn those things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I agree with you completely. And you know, one of the other cast members here, and this is really kind of our main introduction, I think, to Connie Nielsen as an actress, but I found her, and every time I watch this film, I find her to be incredibly moving, especially as she is playing this dangerous game of the road she has to walk as, her amoral, power-hungry brother comes to the throne of Rome, wants her, and, she also then sides with the Roman senators who want to put Maximus in charge so we can restore the Republic. And everything that she and this is what when you were talking about the way in which many of these actors, I feel like just a look told you everything you needed to know about what the character was going through. And there are so many times she has absolutely no lines, but her face says everything. And it's like her face is a billboard. And it's phenomenal. And it really does almost feel as though so many of the scenes she has, there are just subtitles for the expressions on her face, like because you're reading it all over her face. And I'm again watching this film. I'm constantly impressed with work that she does here, because it's a terrible position that this character is in.
I really enjoy her performance, and like you said, she walks a tightrope, and that comes across on screen and in her facial reactions. Again, great actress. The thing that takes me out of the film, though, is the constant use of British accents for characters that are supposed to be Roman, which are more Italian. I'd really would like to see them play it more Italian than British. But so that, and I think her performance in particular takes me out of it just a bit. It's no fault of hers, just how they decided to play it. It's fine. It's common in depictions of Rome. For some reason I don't fully understand still, probably having to do with the British stage, but I think her performance is made. What I like, this is just a moment having to do with her character. I like when Commodus calls her a busy bee, because that's a hearkening back to Marcus Aurelius's Meditations. I don't know how much of Marcus Aurelius's Meditations you've read, but there's a passage in there when he says, when you get up in the morning, you're lazy, you don't feel like getting out of bed, just want to stay warm. Look out the window and see the birds building their nests and, bees building their honeycombs. All the creatures of the earth are out there trying to do their part to make order out of the chaos around them. And, where do we humans get off being lazy and wanting to stay in bed? So just calling her a busy bee is an interesting hearkening back to Marcus Aurelius's Meditations themselves.
Yeah, no, I think all of that is great. One of the things that we've kind of been touching on a little bit throughout this conversation, and I think it's really interesting, is obviously this movie, because it features Marcus Aurelius. The film itself really does feel like a meditation on power, and the idea of how power is used. You have Marcus Aurelius thinking about the way that he's used power, the fact that he's been at war most of his reign as emperor. Was it the right thing to do? Was it necessary? Did it matter? All of these wars. You have Maximus, who's somebody who doesn't want power at all. He literally just wants to be at home with his family to provide for them, basically to use his power for the benefit of his family. And then, of course, you have Commodus, who's a power-hungry maniac who only wants power so he can literally do whatever he wants to do, whenever he wants to do it, and have nobody question him. And then you have, the senators who, they want power. They say to have it more evenly distributed, to quote unquote give it back to the people and create a public system again. And so you have all of these different levels of people who are desiring to utilize power in some way, shape, or form. And it is very interesting that, much like Braveheart, that this movie seems to, at least from my reading, kind of land on this idea that power is to be used for the benefit of others, to give others their freedom. And any other use of power is kind of an abuse of that. And I just find it very interesting that both Braveheart and then, of course, this movie seem to kind of fall down in the same side when it comes to the idea of why we use power, why we might even use violent power. what war might be for, and all of those type of things, which I find really interesting.
And honestly, it seems more salient now than it did 20 years ago. With authoritarianism on the rise around the world, and arguably here in the United States as well. People have made the comparison between the United States and the Roman Republic a great many times, right? For good reason. The Roman Republic declined, and it declined into an empire. And did you pick up on the fact that one of the characters, Maximus's right-hand man, whatever his role was supposed to be, was named Cicero, and it couldn't have been the historical Cicero because the time periods don't match up, right? But the character was named Cicero, presumably pointing back to the actual historical Cicero, who was constantly decrying the decline of the Republic and the rise of authoritarianism with Julius Caesar. So, this is obviously commentary on solidified power versus distributed power, and that's an issue the United States is facing currently, I think.
Well, and something that you had mentioned on our outline was, Maximus asked the question of what is Rome, the ideal of Rome, and, the whole ideal that Rome had once been a republic, but ceased to be, hundreds of years ago at this point. And it's all because people took it upon themselves to make themselves emperor. And, I think it's so fascinating to be able to think through this idea, because the question, and I think you're absolutely right, the question in this film, what is Rome, and is really a question of what is the West for us today. Right. And have we strayed from those ideals, and I think that's really what the film to me seems to try to be getting us to ask. In the same way, it's asking it of the Roman society there. And I think the reason that is because the film is I think really pointing us to that fact of, like, if you don't learn from history, you're doomed to repeat it. And so if we don't ask ourselves these questions, the same way Rome really never asked itself these questions, it fell into decadence and destruction, right? So will that happen to us if we don't ask ourselves these questions, which is one of the things I think the film is really driving at with this question about power.
This is a really interesting line of reasoning, because arguably, we here in the United States have our own version of this narrative, right? What does it mean to be an American? What does it mean to be a citizen of the United States? What is the United States? What are its ideals? What are its founding principles? What is it? And frankly, it's not even a Roman question to ask. It's a Greek question to ask. What are the essential characteristics of justice, or the essential characteristics of a good society, right? That's not a Roman question. That's a Greek question, right? And where I think things, fail a bit in the Roman mindset in the actual world. I think where the Roman Empire probably failed is they wanted to kind of live in the shadow of the Greeks. They wanted to build an empire, but they couldn't ask these questions in the way that the Greeks could, right? They're more like the builders and the project managers and the emperors, and they're not the philosophers of the Hellenistic world, so to speak. So, we have this, here in the United States, and by extension, the Western world as a whole, we kind of walk this line between being part Roman and part Greek in our mindset, and just coming along and asking, what is Rome, in some abstract, idealistic, lofty sense. I mean, even Marcus Aurelius couldn't do that. He didn't do that in his writing, right? That's not a question that really meshes well with the Roman mindset. They're too busy conquering, and they're too busy building, and they're too busy, creating an empire. They're not sitting around philosophizing and asking about their ideals, although certain, ideals of, courage and bravery and expansion, and there certainly are ideals, but I just don't think they have the kind of abstract loftiness that you get in the Greek world, or arguably even here in the United States.
Well, I mean, again, I think it really just comes down to the fact that we consistently see, through every period of history, there is this, you think of Ecclesiastes, there's nothing new under the sun. And we like to pretend like that's not true. And I think especially in our day and age, and like most of these days and ages that we've had in the past, there's a chronological snobbery as C.S. Lewis called it, that we think we know better, and we don't really need to know what people knew then because we know what we know now, and that's better. But, not understanding that all of that is built on something, and it's all connected. And the biggest part of this is that, are we going to learn the lessons from the past that doomed other societies, or are we just going to kind of fall into the same trap? And what we see time and time again is that we just fall into the same traps, and another society finally falls and another rises in its place because they're not willing to learn and to
was it Hegel that said what we learn from history is that we don't learn from history?
There you go. And so and I think that the interesting thing that this movie also does is that by having these meditations on power, it also allows us to kind of go back and see these gory games. And the movie doesn't shy away from showing us the goriness of the games and people salivating over the idea of watching somebody die. I was thinking in the ways in which, even Maximus's line, "Are you not entertained?" gets at this idea at pointing out how awful it is that people are cheering for the death of somebody. How cheap life has become when it becomes entertainment or convenience. And that to me was terribly fascinating because this movie still resonates with that even today.
The Romans are such a paradoxical people, because obviously they were brutal in many different ways in the Colosseum and around the world. But at the same time, they can be some of the most tenderest, loving, Italian people, right? I'm thinking, for example, of like Roman funerary inscriptions along the Appian Way. You read those and they're incredibly touching and sentimental. And you're like, wow, how are these the same people that are, cheering for gladiators in the Colosseum? It's a paradox.
Well, and I do think that what that shows us today is the ability for people to have that cognitive dissonance and not even to be able to realize it, right? And I think,
and also that we have the cognitive dissonance and they maybe didn't.
Well,
right?
I would say they
Our values
do.
have changed. We live in the Christian era.
Yeah,
right?
But I would say that they do because in some ways, but even more so, yes. And I think you raise an incredibly salient point, and I'm referencing a bunch of Tom Holland books today, but I encourage anybody to read it because it's phenomenal. His book Dominion, about the way in which the society that we have today, the West, is literally built on the back of Judeo-Christian values and how we cannot get away from it. And yet
we have an identity crisis
exactly.
about it. It's like we want to be humble and meek and mild and have all the Judeo-Christian virtues that go with that, but we also love those Romans and we like to build and we like to conquer and we like the individual heroism and we're fundamentally torn between these two different historical ideals.
Well, and then too, he makes the point that if you were to take away those values, none of the things that we hold to make any sense. Without that, you don't have any basis for inalienable human rights or any of those type of things. So, and that's a whole other discussion. But I think, again, this movie, by allowing us to see death as entertainment, it should really make us question those places where we have cognitive dissonance about the idea of death, where life is so cheap that it becomes an entertainment or a convenience. And obviously that's the point of the Hunger Games series as well. And it's one of the reasons why I think they became so popular is that they actually pinpointed our cognitive dissonance, but people then just took it as entertainment and didn't think about it. And that's where, as we've been saying this whole time, the goal then should be for us to wrestle with these ideas and come out the other side, hopefully better for having wrestled with them instead of just pretending like they don't exist.
I think I've always had an interest in classics and Roman history, ancient history in general. But as I've gotten older, I've developed an interest in the more practical areas of philosophy, Stoicism in particular, because it's just so useful for living a good life and keeping things in perspective. And I think from a Stoic perspective, you could say this movie is a broadly Stoic movie. Emperors die and their reign ends. The things we build are built and then they decay. The Colosseum is a good example. Anything that's built is going to decay over time. empires will decay, or republics will decay into empires. Everything we build has its time limit on it, however tangible or intangible it might be. And given that, that could easily slip into nihilism, right? I mean, all of life could become a big farce, right? If none of it matters and everything's finite, what's the point of any of it? And what's unique about Stoicism, I think, is that it manages somehow to acknowledge the finitude of things and maybe the potential meaninglessness of things, but still prioritizing duty and harmony with nature and the logos and order to the cosmos. And this movie manages to I think do justice to both. I mean, there's finitude and death writ large inside the movie, and at the same time, ideals are still held up, and there's still meaningfulness, and there's still purpose, and there's still all of the virtues that Marcus Aurelius advocated for. I think the movie does a great job of conveying Stoicism in dramatic form.
Yeah, I think what's interesting is, in some ways, the movie even can't escape our own Judeo-Christian values, because there's a reward for Maximus at the end to go to Elysium, and to be with his family, and that is because, of course, he lived a good life, right? And so I would say that's a terrible way of looking at Christendom, because that would be an incorrect view, of that if you live a good life, you go to heaven. That's not how it works in there. But it's a cultural conception that that's how it works. So I do find that to be incredibly interesting. And yeah, I do think that, the movie can only go so far, of course. And it's not really meant in many ways to make us ask too deep of questions, especially about Stoicism. But I think you're right.
It's important to remember that the Roman Empire was heterogeneous, right? I mean, it's an inherently cosmopolitan society. We've got this religion and that religion and this culture and that culture and this ethnicity and that ethnicity and this cosmogenic myth and this cosmogenic myth, right? And so Romans didn't sweat it too much. There's a reason that skepticism, arose in the Roman Empire, because with that many different beliefs, living alongside each other, well-educated, sophisticated Romans were like, how can we know, you've got your beliefs and I've got mine, and that's the end of the story. So skepticism was just as popular as Stoicism for that very reason. So Romans didn't sweat it too much, I don't think.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right in that. One of the things that, before we kind of wrapped up, we talked about, the production of the film, but I do think that this is one of those movies, and mainly too because it became such a big thing all in and of itself, which was the music. Hans Zimmer's score to this film really took on a life of its own, but it truly is one of those scores that makes the movie pop off the screen in a way that if it wasn't there, the movie would not be the same. And so, I mean, did you love it as much as everybody else? Is this still something that resonates with you, that you'll listen to as you're studying, or, whatever, to get you going, in a battle sequence music, or is it just something that you enjoyed in the film, but, whatever?
I can't say I've listened to the score on its own, absent the film, but I think the score has to do a really difficult job. There are some incredibly dramatic, epic scenes. And so the score's got to carry that and drive that forward, of course. But it's such a human film at the same time. And actually, while I was watching the film again early this morning, in preparation for recording this today, the portion of the score that stood out to me was the death sequence where Marcus Aurelius is killed by Commodus. It's an incredibly haunting, subtle score, and it just worked so well in that moment. And it's just a complicated score. It's got to be epic, and it's got to be human and subtle at the same time. It does a really good job of it. That works really well.
I completely agree with you. I think that the beauty of the score is the way that it accentuates all of the moments, from the big to the small. And
did you have a favorite moment or two from the score in the film?
I do. I do think it just comes right at the beginning with the battle sequence where, you know, they unleash hell and the music kind of unleashes it on you as well, right? And it creates that sense of driving motion that fits perfectly with every single moment that's being displayed on screen. And so, yeah, I think that's, as you mentioned too, there's that moment, and then you can juxtapose that with the beauty of that moment and the heartbreak of that moment as a father is murdered by his son. And it's just so powerful in both places. I think that's incredibly well done. The talent there of Zimmer to bring that home in both places is excellent, and it really works.
Where I think the score fails a little bit for me is that I just have a preference for highly melodic pieces, and I'm struggling, even as we're talking right now, to think of a strong theme or motif that I could hum off the top of my head for you. I can't think of a strong theme or melody from this film that I remember. And you know, unlike say Braveheart, where I think there are motifs in Braveheart that just stick with me, and they stick with me to this day. And I have a hard time grasping onto a strong theme that hooks me in my memory, at least.
Man, that's really interesting because I'm the opposite. There's a few in this film that I can still hum in my head. And so, yeah, I mean, it could
be that I've seen Braveheart 30 times and I've seen this like 4.
There
right?
you go.
So.
But I think it's one of those things where it's like, this is definitely a score to go back and to be able to enjoy and try and listen to outside of the film, because it is, again, really well done. And I think the hauntingness of the use of vocal artists as well in the score really accentuates that. And I, in the same way, we've talked about the Lord of the Rings, but you know, Peter Jackson did the same thing in the Lord of the Rings films and really used that to the benefit with the score that Howard Shore did. So I think it's great.
I would say in contrast, you know, it's interesting you mentioned Lord of the Rings from a score standpoint, because I remember the first time I saw The Fellowship of the Ring, I remember being in the car on the drive home from that, humming the music.
Right,
I think it just stuck with me immediately. And the themes in this one just don't stick with me in particular for some reason I can't explain.
Well, with all of that said, I can't wait to see where you're going to end up with a rating for Gladiator.
Oh, this is a clear 5 out of 5. This is a great, great film. It's emotional. It's epic. Great characters, great acting, great visuals, great score. There's nothing bad about this movie whatsoever. I would say the one weakness for me is probably I might have tightened up some of the war sequences at the beginning of the film. It probably just owed a little too much to Braveheart there and trying to live up to the epic quality. I would have trimmed that maybe a little bit. But other than that, this is a great, great film. So I'm going to give it 5 out of 5. Let's use something Latin here. How about 5 out of 5 Gladii, Roman swords?
This is a 5. I mean, hands down. It's just a great film. I enjoy rewatching it every time I do, and it continues to stand up. And if you haven't, I would highly encourage anybody. There's a great making of documentary on the Blu-ray, or the 4K, or DVD, or whatever you've got, and it's so good. It talks about all of the stuff that goes into this film. It's a really in-depth one as well. It's I think 2.5 hours. But it's so worth your time to see all that they put into this film. So, but Zach, if people wanted to catch up with you and see everything that you're doing, where can they find you?
Yeah, there are 2 good places. You can find me on my website, ZacharyFruhling.com, where I tend to write about philosophy and sometimes philosophy and film. And you can always follow me still to this very day on the app formerly known as Twitter. I'm just at Zachary Fruhling.
And, of course, you can find me all over social media under the name MattRushing02. Of course, here on the network, you can find me with Literary Tracks, The Orb, Warp 5, Artificial Tango, and Saddle Up. And then over on the Nerd Party Network, you'll find me with 2 shows. One is called Owl Post, about every single chapter of the Harry Potter series, and Aggressive Negotiations, talking to John Mills about Star Wars each and every week. But thank you so much for joining us. And are you not entertained?